Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Jarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support in our recent content, and before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes, and game one of all of the first round matchups in the books, over and done. And we got a lot of quality games. There were some that were a little bit underwhelming, but some of them were expected given the matchups. But I think that we still got a lot to talk about, so we'll get into it. We'll start off, I guess, with Warriors Rockets, right? Because if you're watching this, that was the most recent game, right? And I think, the one that was highly anticipated,
Yes,
right? And the Warriors ended up winning it 95-85. And pretty much a lot of the things that we discussed going into this game kind of played out that way, right? Where we talked about the idea of like, hey, Amen Thompson, Dylan Brooks, Fred VanVleet, Tari and all those guys are great defenders. But you could just have a game where Steph and Jimmy just pop off. And that's exactly what happened for Golden State. Steph had 31 points, 6 rebounds, 3 assists, 12 of 19 from the field, 5 of 9 from 3. A lot of just back-breaking, just ridiculous shots, like the type of shots that it's very tough to bounce back from if you're the other team, where you played them perfectly, you forced them into the shot that you want them to take, ideally if you're the defense, contested fall away, deep threes, didn't matter, still went in. Jimmy Butler did a great job as Robin, right? Doing his thing, especially when Steph was off the floor, and especially at different points when the game was starting to get away. He had 5 steals, 7 rebounds, 6 assists, 1 of 2 from 3, showing that playoff Jimmy is still there. You got some decent moments from some of the other guys. Brandon Pajemski, shaky had a couple of moments, but overall solid game. 14 points, 8 rebounds, 5 assists, 2 steals. Moses Moody hit a big shot towards the end of the game, and Draymond did his thing on the defensive end. Not much else outside of that. You got a couple of Gary Payton moments, Guy Santos, couple moments, but not really a whole lot from a lot of the second unit guys for the Warriors. And again, it was a really good win for them. Obviously, they're the ones on the road. This to me was kind of the series that felt like the most, I don't want to say obvious, but like the one that seemed like the most likely to be an upset, just given the discrepancy in terms of the high-end talent. Like the Rockets do have a lot of solid players, young team, deep team, but the Warriors do have the better 2 stars. I would say 2 of the 3 best players in the series. And games like these are kind of one of the reasons why it seems, kind of tough to bet against Golden State. But, it wasn't all bad from Houston's perspective, right? From the Warriors' perspective, again, your stars showed up. You played great on the defensive end, and you were able to make the momentum plays when you needed to, right? So you got all that going for you. And then for the Rockets, you look at it from the perspective of Alperen Sengun, right? Did his thing. We talked about him. He was a key matchup, right? Where he's the guy that they're going to probably have to play through because he's got the advantages as a big who can score around the basket, right? 26 points, 9 rebounds, 3 steals, only 1 assist and 5 turnovers. So if there is one blemish, that's probably that. It has to do with the way the Warriors were guarding him. They're playing him one-on-one and just kind of, I don't want to say baiting him, but like they're basically like, we'll take our chances with him scoring around the basket. And he was dominating early. Because the Rockets had an early lead. And then eventually they surrendered it to Golden State. Golden State never really looked back, went up by as much as 20 in the third quarter. And then the Rockets made a comeback doing what they needed to do. They were able to get offensive rebounds, get second chance opportunities. Steven Adams was awesome in this game. He had 5 offensive rebounds, 12 boards, plus 4 in a game that they lost by 10. And it felt like every time he was out there, he was very helpful for them. And they were forcing Golden State into some turnovers. Golden State had a long stretch where they did not score. And that's, one of the advantages of what the Rockets can do defensively. But then you look at the offensive end of the floor for Houston, 16 turnovers. Your starting backcourt was a combined 7 for 34. And that's just not going to be able to get it done, right? Fred VanVleet, 4 of 19, 2 of 13 from 3. And then Jalen Green, right? That was another key guy, like a big X factor for Houston that you were hoping to see better from. Had 8 rebounds, but only had 7 points and was 3 for 15. A lot of, kind of usual unfortunate Jalen Green plays where just kind of feels like there's not enough balance in terms of sometimes playing out of control, sometimes playing with too much speed. And, if he can figure that out at some point, that can help him out a lot. Even Amen Thompson looked kind of rough in this game. He had some moments, but, defensively, couldn't really do much. Not his fault. It is what happens. He got more comfortable later on, but you could just kind of tell, that again, for a lot of these guys, it was their first big playoff moment. Tari Eason came in and had some moments. Jabari Smith Jr. came in and hit some big shots in the third and fourth quarter. It feels like for the Rockets, you're almost going to have to probably stay big, where it's like that's your advantage, where you have a giant team, you can get offensive rebounds on this Warriors team because they're small. And they're going to compete on the boards, but there's not a whole lot they can really do. I mean, Houston had a plus 16 rebounding advantage, 52 rebounds to Golden State's 36, and had 22 offensive rebounds to Golden State's 6. So they did their job in terms of the boards, and I thought defensively, by and large, the Rockets did perfectly fine. You held Golden State to 95. They did shoot 47% from the field and 38% from three, and they had 11 turnovers, but the offensive end of the floor was the problem mainly for Houston. And that's where you feel like if they're going to win the series, that has to improve because they only had 85 points. And I want to say they had 34 at halftime, which is just a ridiculously low amount. But some of that's going to have to come from some of these guys just being better. And I think, if you're both teams, you can feel like there's a better version of either of these teams, like in future games, right? Because if you're Golden State, you can say, maybe we don't have as good of a game from Steph and Jimmy Butler, but maybe some of the other role players play a little bit better and it's like a more balanced offensive attack. But then also from the Rockets' perspective, you could say, is our backcourt going to shoot 7 for 34 again? I mean, they could because, neither of these guys have played that great against Golden State over the course of the season. But I think you're at least hoping and banking on maybe there's a wild card. Maybe Jabari Smith can get more minutes, right? Because, even though he was a -6, it felt like he had a good impact out there, and he was a big part of them getting back into the game, right? Like some of the plus minuses are going to be skewed just because of what happened over the course of the game. But I don't know. I felt like it was kind of rough that he ended up bringing back Jalen Green into the game because he just wasn't good. And I just didn't think there was a version of well, can we hope that he plays better in the last few minutes? And it's probably not. He probably should have just stayed big and just kind of stuck with it. But, again, I think it's just a factor of you're kind of hoping and praying that these guys can kind of figure it out over the course of the series. But, they're going to have to figure out something because obviously they lost at home. So now home court advantage is gone. Could they go into Golden State and pull off a win? Sure. They could, because even though the Warriors played well, right, it still kind of feels like it doesn't feel like it's an unbeatable situation if you're the Rockets. But the performances by Steph and Jimmy is kind of the reason why, it might be really difficult for the Rockets. Because if they can't slow those guys down and they just have great performances, it might be a quick series. But I don't think you're banking on 63% shooting from Steph from the field and 55% from three. But he can do this type of stuff against some of these teams. It doesn't matter what type of defense you throw at him sometimes. He's a superstar.
Yeah, and I kind of want to focus on the Rockets' perspective mainly because that was my pick, but you do have to shout out the greatness of Steph because we already saw within the first quarter. I thought that was the best basketball that the Rockets could have possibly played. I think on both ends of the floor, they were kind of limiting what Steph was able to do damage wise from the 3-point line, but that's the problem. Yeah. Steph is such a great player where one of his most underrated factors isn't even the off-ball movement. It's also his ability to finish at the rack. He's a great freaking finisher. And I think the Rockets completely forgot about that and for some reason kind of just let him, do that. But, off the ball movement, the conditioning, we already know the storyline with Steph, Jimmy, shout out to him as well. But yeah, from the Houston Rockets perspective, I don't even know what to say because I think this was such a winnable game. Like I said, the first quarter, you really kind of set the tone. Granted, you did let it kind of slip towards the end of the first quarter, but you were making a very big statement, I think, defensively. You were leaving guys who you don't really trust on Golden State wide open to hit shots. They didn't hit them. And you were really forcing Steph and Jimmy to carry the load. And I think that's what the series is going to come down to. Is it sustainable? Probably, I would say so at this point. But, with Houston, my God, you cannot lose the turnover battle in the way that you did. I think that was the biggest key to me. Like the missed shots are cool because, it's like you got the lead down to 5-3 even at points where it's like, exactly. This is a winnable game in the fourth quarter. And what do you guys decide to do? Get rattled and turn the ball over. You have to credit the Golden State defense because they were throwing some amazing defensive coverages where you don't know if it's man or they bait you into a zone. And then it switches to man all of a sudden, and you're on the floor with an offensive foul. Jalen Green, I'm talking to you. Like, there's things like that that just kind of get on my nerves as somebody who picked the Houston Rockets to win this series, because it was 100% a winnable game. Now it's a must-win game too. And if you lose game 2, the series is most likely over. But I think they did the majority of the things that you would have needed to win this game. You know, you won the offensive rebound battle, which was a huge necessity. You know, you scored off of it as well. The second chance points were pretty good as well. Defensively, you know, you kept guys not in a comfortable spot, because we already know, like, yes, Steph, you know, was hitting a lot of threes, but those are some tough shots. Those are probably shots that only he could hit. You know, like, that's a 1% kind of shot, and, you know, you kind of have to live with that. You kept Jimmy off the line relatively well. You know, we've seen him have higher free throw games as well. So, you know, I think there were so many aspects that I loved, but offensively and not taking care of the ball and the three-point shooting, we already knew that that was going to be rough in terms of, you know, the lack of three-point shooting. I believe they're like the second worst offense in the playoffs. If Orlando wasn't here, they'd be the worst as the 2 seed, which is insane. I think that really speaks to how good and tenacious their defense is. But, you know, overall, you really couldn't buy anything from the 3-point line. And, you know, I didn't like the commentary about Fred VanVleet. They were saying he was trying, but you got to swing the ball, man. Like, at that point, you're forcing it. You know, 2 for 13 from the 3-point line. I really didn't know what to say. Jalen Green, we talked about this on our live stream. Please go check that out. It was like, you know, raw thoughts, raw predictions. Like, you know, we wanted to really set the tone of how we thought that this, you know, game was going to go. Jalen Green did exactly what we said he was going to do. He got baited, turned the ball over, inefficient, shot chucking, bad, rushing the offense, you know, just kind of barreling into the lane when you have guys like Draymond, when you have guys like Gary Payton around you bothering you, and you're getting hit with contact and you're just flailing around. Second thing, I didn't like the reffing at points. I thought it was kind of awkward, very weird. Definitely not an excuse for Houston by any means necessary, because there were missed calls on both sides of the ball. But, you know, there were some blatant fouls, I think, that Şengün, he should have been at the line for, but we're not going to, you know, gripe over that. And shout out to him, because I think he had a good game offensively, but he can't do it by himself, clearly, you know, especially if he's going to be the only guy pretty much the entire game in double figures outside of who, like Jabari Smith Jr. Like, the rest are really garbage time points. Like, Dylan Brooks hit a 3 at the end. Like, we're not in double figures, bro. VanVleet barely double figures. You know, Jabari Smith Jr. And shout out to him, because he did a lot, I think, you know, on both ends of the floor. But once again, it's all kind of washed away because you turned the ball over 4 times. Crucial moments. And, you know, Tari Eason came in. They have the defense to really stifle this team, but it's so frustrating. And I feel for Rockets fans, because I wanted to give them the benefit of the doubt in terms of this offensive struggles thing, because, you know, I didn't watch the most Houston basketball, but when I was doing, like, you know, the research in terms of talking about this team, I had heard that the sentiment was, you know, a lot of Jalen Green's inefficiency and a lot of Fred VanVleet's inefficiency came because of the fact that they didn't really have a ton of creation. Because if even in this game, you saw it, there were tons of grenade shots. We're talking like 4 seconds left in the shot clock, and guys are chucking stuff up. Even Şengün, he had a 1 foot, you know, fading 3 on the elbow. Things like that, where that's kind of been the staple of Houston's offense. So I kind of gave them the benefit of the doubt that those guys, the guards, were taking a lot of those shots during the regular season. But now that I'm seeing it with my own 2 eyes, you know, in the playoffs, my God, it's just inefficient, wide open. It's more than grenades. So that's probably, you know, just bad takes on my end, but I genuinely think my pick is in danger. And if you didn't know, I picked this team to win this game in 7, or win the series in 7 games, excuse me. But at this point, I don't know if that's even feasible. And once again, shout out to Golden State, because they did everything that they needed to do.
Yeah, and like you said, the defense wasn't really the problem, because like you said, the Warriors only, and like I said, the Warriors only scored 95, and a number of those Steph shots are the type of shots that you live with, but they still went in. And you just don't have a guy like that on the Rockets roster. And I think you're hoping and banking on, well, there's no way these guys are going to shoot 20% from the field again.
Right.
And, like, I think that's the hope if you're the Rockets hope, if you pick the Rockets to win the series. I think you're hoping that game one jitters out of the way,
Yes.
more comfortable in the next game and going forward. And that might help, with some of the offensive execution. But again, some of these guys are flawed offensive players. And that's, again, we knew this going into the season. The second half of the season, their offense was a lot better. But the question was, how sustainable was it going into the playoffs? Because we know that some of these guys, are as players. Like Van Vliet's a solid player, but he is a guy that's not particularly known for being a super efficient offensive player.
Sure.
He can play make, he can defend, and he's a very undersized guard, so you give him props for that. But there are a lot of times where it just kind of feels like the ball finds its way to him when it probably shouldn't. But then it's like, who else can you really ask?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, if it's not him, Jalen Green, can't really trust him either. Dylan Brooks, okay. I mean, I think you'll live with that probably if you're Golden State. And then after that, most of the other guys just aren't threats from the 3-point line. Like
Sure.
Amen Thompson isn't really that much of a 3-point shooter.
No.
Şengün made one in this game, but like you said, it was a Hail Mary, shot clock cheese type of
Yes.
shot. I mean, he took another three, I think, in the first half.
Yeah.
That was like just a regular one that was given to him.
Mhm.
But again, like if you're him, most of his shots were within 15 feet.
Yeah.
Because those are the shots that Golden State's given him. And I think you can see he's got a big advantage in this series, which makes a ton of sense. It's just, again, like you said, for most of the game, he was the only guy for Houston in double figures. And if that happens, that's kind of a recipe for getting your butt kicked. But they did come back in the game. Like, they got back into the game. So it's not like all hope is lost, but they're going to have to do way better in game two if they want to win this series. Because if you lose both games in Houston,
Yeah.
I mean, that's probably a wrap, because then you have to win at least 2 in Golden State, and that's assuming you don't lose any more in Houston the rest of the way. And I think that'd be pretty tough.
I think the game lived up to its hype though. Like I wasn't walking away like, what the heck did I just watch? It was more so like,
Right.
well, I guess
Yeah.
from a Rockets perspective, Rockets fans
When
are
they
probably
went
like,
down by
what the
20,
heck?
when they went down by 20, it felt kind of rough, because it's like,
Sure.
well, what can they really do? But then, like, you look up and then you're like, what the heck? How is it a 4-point game? And I
that's
think
the upside of that
speaks to-
defense, bro.
Yeah. And that speaks to the strengths and the flaws of both teams, right? Because like Golden State was able to go up 20, but then just as quickly just gave it back, because then they started turning the ball over, and then they started having an offensive drought, and that speaks to some of the weaknesses and some of the guys that they're banking on. Like they banked on Quentin Post, right, being able to knock down some shots. I don't think he hit any at all, right? Yeah,
No.
he was 0 for 3, 0 for 2 from 3. Buddy Hield, I think, was 1 for 4, not even off of 3. I think it was off of like a mid-range or a layup or
Yes,
something
it
like
was.
that.
It was a mid-range.
Yeah,
Mid-range pull-up.
yeah, exactly. Guy Santos, right? He had 5, had a 3, and then I think had a trip to the line. But
Yes.
it's just rough. Like it just feels like, I think against, for Houston, like they are a really good story, but you can just kind of feel like they need some other guy. You know what I mean? Like
It's
they
clear.
have to have somebody come in and step up. But then, like from Golden State's perspective, it feels like you could probably get by in this series doing this, but I feel like it may be a little bit tougher against some of the stronger teams, because like you look at the minute spread and it's like Jimmy Butler has to play 42 minutes and Steph Curry has to play 40 minutes.
Yeah.
And that's fine in the first round because of the fact that all these games you have multiple days off. But, once you get to the conference finals, then it's like you're playing every other night. And, that kind of happened with the Lakers a couple years ago, where in the early rounds, it was fine and they were able to get through it. And then once they got to the conference finals, it just became a little too much to overcome. And you could tell guys were just gassed. But again, I picked Golden State to win this series because I think the floor of the Warriors stars is higher than, what you can expect to get from the Rockets. Like, could this be a floor? Maybe, because that's the nice thing about the Rockets is like, they were down by 20, but they were never completely out of it, because they did come back into the game. Because like you said, even when they're not hitting shots, they just get every offensive rebound and they can get back into the game that way. But the half-court offense, the execution is going to have to be much stronger, and I just don't know what adjustments you can really make for that. I think you can at least say, all right, you're probably going to have to play Steven Adams more, even though he played like 20 minutes. So he still played a decent amount, but you're probably going to have to play him more. and you're probably going to have to play some of the other bench guys a little bit more. But then you look over and you still have to get more out of like a Jalen Green. And it's funny, look at the Rockets minute spread. Like Fred VanVleet played 40 minutes, and then the next highest guy was Şengün, who played 35, and then everyone else was like around 30 or lower because, it's just there wasn't really a lot you could really look to. Because, like, yeah, Jalen Green came back into the game, but even with him coming back into the game, they could tell he just didn't have it. So, I mean,
he
I guess
immediately made it worse. And I'm not trying to like dog him while he's down, but bro,
Right.
like it was a 5-point game, and he came in, and I think it immediately went to 10. If I'm not mistaken. So
I guess, if you're Houston, what adjustments, other than what I mentioned, or maybe I don't have the right adjustments, like what can you do to maybe fix some of that, outside of just make more shots? And maybe that's the real answer here is just make more shots. But is there anything else that they can do to maybe make it easier for some of these guys? Because there were a couple of possessions where it was like Amen Thompson, I think, was like in the post, like, or near the basket on Steph, and it looked kind of clunky, but it worked, and it just felt like, oh, that's kind of something that maybe you just kind of save in the back pocket for later. But I don't know if those guys are going to be able to just go out and do stuff like that.
Yeah, and that's the tough part because in theory, you look at the Warriors and the personnel that they have, you would say hunt the mismatch. That would be the logical decision, like you just talked about. Hunt Steph. Hunt the other guys who are a little bit smaller. Those guys' hands are quick. Like, I mean, they tried it. They really did. And that's where the bulk of their turnovers came from. You have the size advantage. You have Jabari Smith Jr. posting up guys, but he turns the ball over 4 times. Amen Thompson, pretty much, same thing. He got ripped, I think, and threw it out of bounds, too, as well. Play with a little bit more control. That's what I would like to see. Maybe slow it down, but I guess it's kind of hard to slow it down when most of your shots are coming, at the end of the shot clock anyways. But, you kind of have to make your shots, I guess, continue to hunt the mismatch, play smarter, but it is hard because the Warriors defense is that good as well. Like, you can't really just paint match their team because they don't really let you get a clean look at the basket because they are, reaching in, and they have guys like Jimmy Butler who have great hands, Gary Payton as well. Like, there's a lot of contact at the rim. Like, yeah, there might not be a whole lot of rim protection, but, the contact and bothering guys, I think, is what, this team struggled with. Because even Amen Thompson, like, he's generally a great finisher around the rim, a very high, field goal percentage, but, he kind of got bothered a lot by contact. Jalen Green as well. So, just be more physical because they're a physical defensive team. So you would think that it would kind of translate to their offense, but it seems like it just kind of went out the window. And, you can't really look past Steven Adams, I guess, in terms of the depth chart for any help. Like, I guess it would be nice to have a Cam Whitmore out there, but he barely played in the regular season. Reed Shepherd, it would be nice in theory to have, what he could be, but he didn't play either. So, you're kind of stuck with the 8 guys that you're going to have to play, and they have to figure it out. And I think the majority of it really does come down to making your open shots because, like, Jalen Green's, most of his 3-pointers weren't even, like, really contested. Like, he was pretty much wide open, and he just freaking rushed it. I think it was more of a mental thing, you're just rushing stuff. And, another thing, make your free throws. Make your free throws. Yeah. Bro, they had 20 free throws.
Yeah, 11 of 20 from because they had more free throws than Golden State. Because, like you said, like we said, that would be a key for Houston in the series. So, like, they kept Golden State off the free throw line. Like, Jimmy Butler went to the line 6 times, but that's less than what he's been doing, where he's getting to the line like 10 times in a game, and he still only shot 4 for 6. But then no one else had more than 2.
Yep.
So you'll take that, and a couple of those were just like fouls that are just gonna happen sometimes, right? Like,
some of them were fouls that shouldn't have happened, and that's where I was talking about the refereeing, though. Like, where it's like, why is that even a freaking foul? But hey,
but you know what I mean, like, just from the perspective, and then they shot 11 of 20 from the free throw line and 6 of 29 from 3, and still 39% from the field, and it was still like a 2-possession game in the fourth quarter.
Very winnable,
so,
very winnable.
But it just feels like that's gonna be the script in this series, where it's like the Rockets could be in those type of games where it's like, man, they're right there, but then they just can't quite finish it off. But I think they'll have at least one game where, like, they'll go off from 3.
I hope it's the next one. It's got to be a home one.
Yeah, so we'll see.
Yeah.
Then moving on, let's look at Lakers Wolves because I think like some of the other ones, like probably just in terms of the order of what people would like to hear about, we don't really have to do that as
Yeah.
much. So the Wolves ended up stomping the Lakers 117-95. This was one where, because we were split on the Warriors Rockets when I picked the Warriors to win that game, you picked the Rockets, but this one we both thought the Lakers were going to win, and looked good in the first quarter, and then after that, not so much, right? I mean, I think at one point the Lakers ended up going down. They were up, I think, 7-7. I think it was like 28-21 or something at the end of the first, something like that. And then they quickly went from being up 7 to down by double digits while Ant was off the floor, and then just kind of stayed consistently down by double digits the rest of the way. Then it got up to like 25 or 27 for Minnesota early because they hit some threes in the third quarter, and it was just over. I think Edwards, he had some cramps, so that the Lakers kind of got back in there, but you knew they weren't really going to. But overall, if you're Minnesota, pretty much like flawless play and game plan in this game. Like you could tell they were really prepared and ready for what to expect from this Lakers team, and on both ends of the floor, right? Because defensively, like they forced the Lakers into some turnovers, and the offense was kind of stagnant. But then like on the offensive end, the Wolves did a great job in generating a lot of really quality looks. Like they shot 21 of 42 from 3. That's 50%. That's a ridiculous percentage. But if you look, most of their 3-point attempts were pretty open. Like there were probably no defenders within like 9-10 feet for the vast majority of the threes that the Wolves took. And like some of them you can understand because it's like you got to live with Jaden McDaniels and Julius Randle threes. You can't just like fall for the jump flyby and let those guys get to the rim. But then sometimes you're going to have games where like, they're going to hit them. You know what I mean? And like the problem was the corner three, because the corner threes, as everybody knows, are the easiest threes. And they gave up a decent amount of them. I think they shot 9 for 12 on corner threes, which again, ridiculous percentage, but a lot of them were open. And it wasn't all giving them to the guys that you want them to take, because then, you had some Naz Reid threes. And like, that's a guy that you shouldn't leave open because we know he's a really good 3-point shooter. A guy like a Mike Conley, we know that guy's a really good 3-point shooter. Even like DiVincenzo was 1 for 5, right? And Nickeil Alexander-Walker was 1 for 6, but it still wasn't like a ton of their shots were very contested. Like I think the one that DiVincenzo made, funny enough, was the one at the end of the second, right? Where it was like kind of a fling shot where it's like, what do you even do about that? But offensively, you could tell this Minnesota team was very comfortable after the first quarter, where it looked early on like they were kind of rattled. Like you had a couple of possessions where they blitzed Edwards and he threw it away. But after that, pretty much, composed game. He shot 8 for 22, but he was 4 of 9 from 3 and had 8 rebounds and 9 assists, which is kind of a pick your poison thing, because it's like, would you rather him score 30 plus and kind of just single-handedly win you the game, or would you rather it be kind of balanced where it's like, oh, he's gotten all these assists, he's giving the ball to shooters and kind of playing like a combo guard, right? Which one do you want him to do? You probably don't want him having 9 assists, right? Because he's still probably going to score at least somewhat, and so that means that like even if it's like 20 and 10, well, that means he was responsible for like a big chunk of Minnesota's points even when he's not scoring. So I think it was just kind of a weird situation to be in. And then from a Lakers perspective, offensively was a problem because they were very stagnant. Just didn't really look like, they were generating good offense. It kind of just felt like a lot of just freewheeling out there, right? It didn't really feel like there was a lot of good things drawn up. And it's obviously like that's not over the course of an entire game, because there's going to be moments where it's like, Luka's cooking in the first quarter. It's pick and roll. Give him the ball and get out of his way. But the second quarter, things fell apart because LeBron and Austin were leading the second unit at the start of the second quarter, and it just didn't work. They were awful. I think Austin had like 2 points in the first half. He finished with 16, but it's one of those examples of like kind of a phony stat line where it's like he wasn't really that good. Like you look at 16, 5 of 13, that doesn't look like it's bad, but like if you rewatch it, no, it was bad. LeBron had 19 and didn't really even take a shot, I think, in the first quarter. I think he took 2, but like didn't really do much in the first quarter offensively. And just seemed like he just didn't have it. He had a lot of possessions where it felt like he was trying to take guys off the dribble and just kind of drive into a brick wall and just get his shot packed. And I just feel like the execution is kind of not what you want. I'd like to see a little bit more variety where it's like maybe some play in the post against some of the smaller Minnesota guards. We talked about stuff like that. Just more balanced offensive attacks because like there are like Minnesota's a really good defensive team, so they don't have a lot of guys you can just hunt in terms of mismatches, but the guys that they do have that you can mismatch hunt against, you have to do it differently. It's not just like, oh, let's get Nickeil Alexander-Walker switched on to us, right? Like, no, he's a guard and he's, not really that big. So if you're LeBron, you got to post him up. Then they also had an interesting combination where they had Jordan Goodwin and Jared Vanderbilt together. And it was with LeBron and Austin, just a very limited offensive unit. Kind of reminds me of what the units were where you had Luka and 4 other defensive guys. I guess the argument is you have those 2 guys around some defenders, but it just felt like because they weren't playing well, you just kind of needed somebody else to kind of help them out, and it just didn't work. And nobody really outside of Luka could really get going offensively. And he only had 1 assist and 5 turnovers, and part of that was just nobody could really hit anything, and he was cooking. But it just felt like offensively, you got to be better if you're the Lakers, because we talked about it, where if they win this series, it's going to be because their 3 main guys are, 3 of the 4 or 5 best players on the floor, right? Where they all have like 20 plus points or combined 70, 80, whatever you want to call it. And then the role players didn't really get anything out of the bench, didn't shoot well, didn't really look that good. And then defensively, right? They played small for most of the game. Jackson Hayes only played 8 minutes, and they got annihilated on the boards. I think Minnesota had, 11 offensive rebounds. It feels like most of those led to immediate buckets. Because even with Jaden McDaniels, he shot 11 for 13. But it wasn't like, oh, he just sprayed you and was like 7 of 10 from 3. He hit 3 threes. Most of them were in the corners. And then a lot of his other offense was like, oh, I'm getting the offensive rebound and putting it right back up. Or, I'm, close to the basket. Like, maybe one mid-range turnaround. But it didn't really feel like, and that's what I'm talking about with their offense, where it didn't really feel like there were a lot of cheesy shots that went in. Like, it felt like it was mostly good offense generated by Minnesota, which you didn't feel like you got from LA. So they got to clean up the boards. Maybe you can see if you can get some more minutes for Hayes out there. And then guys like LeBron and Austin just got to be better, and the role players got to be better. So if that happens in game 2, then they'll probably be able to win game 2 and get back into the series. It's just not a good feeling to get blown out home in game 1 after securing home court, getting time off. Maybe the time off wasn't good for them, who knows? But it just felt like that they kind of came in there just kind of flat and just not really ready, whereas Minnesota, you could tell, was very locked in on what to do. And it was impressive, really, just because I think most people picked the Lakers to win this series, and some people picked it like to be a relatively short series, but I think what you didn't really expect was if it was going to be a blowout in game 1, you probably thought it would be a Laker blowout in game 1, not the other way around where it just looked like the Lakers just kind of stunk it up. So I think you can at least feel like, are they going to be this bad the rest of the way on both ends of the floor? Probably not, but it is at least kind of concerning just from the perspective of some of the concerns that you may have had about the Lakers on both ends of the floor showed up in this game. But I expect guys like LeBron and Austin to be better the rest of the way. Like for some of Austin's stuff, you could say some of it was the matchups, but like some of it was also him just doing stuff that just didn't make much sense, like taking some ill-advised shots. He had like a couple of shots where they were just like 30-foot bombs where it's just like, what are you doing out there? And it just felt like, I don't know, it just felt like there just was not like a lot of, we want to win this game outside of the first quarter. And even then, it was more so like Luka was masking a lot of the other stuff, right? Like he was just baking everybody in the first quarter. And then as soon as he came out, it just all completely went away. So great game plan and great execution by the Wolves, who, you have to feel internally they believe they can win this series. And they should feel that way. But I do think the Lakers can and will be better.
Yeah, 100%. I think they came into this game 100% underprepared. Then they got baited. I think that was the key. I don't think they were prepared to face a Minnesota that wasn't going to play Rudy Gobert, the bulk of the minutes, at the 5, and that's where I think they really got killed because Naz Reid destroyed them.
Yeah.
He had a freaking legacy game, and you have to shout out Ant for not falling into the the traps that he's fallen into in previous years, and even sometimes in the regular season, where one of the most double team players in the league this year, if not the most, and this game he only had 1 turnover and 9 assists. So the assist to turnover ratio was key. He's getting guys involved. And yeah, if Jaden McDaniels and everybody else can show up offensively, that takes Minnesota to a whole nother tier. I think that makes them not even really close to a 6 seed. That makes them more closer to like, a 2 or even a potential 1. But, are you going to get that every night? I don't think they're going to shoot 50% from the 3 and 50% from, the field for the remainder of the series. And I definitely don't expect the Lakers to come out flat like that offensively and defensively. So, overall, I was very disappointed from a Laker perspective from JJ Redick. Lack of adjustments were horrible. And whenever he did adjust, it really didn't make sense. Like you talked about Jordan Goodwin, Vando, what are we doing? And, we talked about it in our live stream going into that series. We talked about the Vando minutes. They're going to be crucial because if he's out there doing pretty much nothing on the offensive end, why is he even really playing at that point? And it kind of reared its ugly head. Exactly. And it kind of reared its ugly head where, you kind of have questions about, is he playable, long term in this setting? I don't know. I really don't know what to say, but you do have to commend, Minnesota for what they did because everybody was just on point and on cue. And I think it rubbed off and trickled down because in the first quarter, Ant looked bad, in my opinion. I was like,
yeah,
what the heck are we doing? Like, seems like Ant of old where, you're just jacking, shooting whatever, bad shots. But, he found his rhythm. Exactly. Found his rhythm, figured it out. And it rubbed off on the other guys like Julius Randle, a guy who's typically not a good playoff performer. He didn't have like the most craziest game, but it was efficient. 7 turnovers, granted, but very efficient from the field when he had the ball. And I think that's going to be key alongside Jaden McDaniels showing up, guys like that. So kind of a fluky performance maybe, but we've also seen, Minnesota does tend to, I guess, rise in the playoffs, at least this group of guys, because Jaden McDaniels actually did this last year in game 1 against Phoenix. So it's not like he is incapable of doing it again. That's I think, the scary part where if he shows up like that, then I think the Lakers will be in trouble in this series. But, it's one game, somewhat, I think, of an overreaction. I still have the Lakers, winning the series. It might not be in 5 like I predicted, but, I think they'll be all right because I don't expect that trio of guys to play that horribly, collectively again. And AR is the guy that I'm really disappointed in. Bron, like you talked about, too much ISO. That was the thing. They got baited into playing isolation basketball, and that's not really their game. I think you have the personnel to do that, but I think you're stronger when the ball is moving, when, guys are kind of more so taking over at the right time instead of, okay, I'm LeBron James, I'm going to go to the basket. And like you said,
too much stagnation.
Exactly. And that's where I think they got baited, where you see that Gobert is not there, and then you think, well, now it's my time to shine, but that's just not really going to cut it, especially since, Minnesota's a long team. They're not, I guess, like, stocky in terms of what, the Lakers are. They have a lot of muscle. The Lakers have muscle, but the Timberwolves have length, and I think that's where, they fell into the trap, and I'm sure they'll be all right. Like I said, I don't think they'll be in trouble, but definitely stunning for sure.
Yeah. And for Gobert, part of it was he got into foul trouble.
Exactly.
Early
Too early foul.
They were attacking Gobert, and kind of getting him switched on to Luka. But, like you said, it felt like the offense was a little bit too one-on-one heavy.
Yep.
And like you said, just not enough ball movement. And again, part of that is look at the assists. I mean, just not a whole lot. And part of it was some guys just could not hit shots. But I just felt like if you're gonna hunt the mismatches, it's got to be in the right spots.
Agreed.
Not all of them can necessarily just attack bigs off the dribble and get to the rim. Some of them are you can take a big, Austin can take a big off the dribble and then kind of get into some pull-up shots, right?
Mhm.
He can hit stuff like that, or he's a speed guy, so he can use his speed at times to get past some of these guys. But it just felt like, yeah, it just felt like they kind of went into this game just kind of like, we'll see what happens, and if whatever happens happens. Whereas it
That's
felt
right.
like Minnesota went in to win the game, and it's more than just that. Like Minnesota was just better in this game,
Yep.
but I do think the Lakers will bounce back and be better. But again, there's some stuff where it's like if Minnesota's role players play that well and the Lakers role players play that poorly, they're they're not going to win probably, because Minnesota's depth is superior to the Lakers in terms of, like, they don't have a guy off the bench like a Nas Reed that could just kind of come in and get like 20.
Yeah.
And like, of course, we know that Gabe Vincent and Dorian Finney-Smith can get hot from three, but Nas Reed can put the ball on the floor and attack guys, and
Take
he
over
can
a game.
score. Yeah, yeah. Whereas those guys are more so guys that play off of the other stars, and that's not to say that, like, you're giving the ball to Nas Reed and having him play ISO. It's just like you said, it feels like he can take over a game offensively in a way that's the other guys can't quite do. And I just feel like the Lakers also just can't be that small for the entire game. Like, I feel like you're gonna have to find at least somewhat more minutes for Jackson Hayes. And maybe Vanderbilt has to play next to him at times. Like, maybe we got to see those two guys together, because at times it feels like if Vando's the center, he's probably not going to be the guy guarding the on-ball player. And if he's not, and he's just kind of out there and without like a specific person to go after, it just feels like it makes him a little bit more useless. Like, it would be nice to see him maybe on Ant for certain possessions, as opposed to kind of being like the small ball five defensively. It just, yeah, I don't know. It just felt kind of weird, but that also is the position you're in when you only really have one center on the roster you feel like he can play. And that's kind of is what we talked about, where, we felt like when the Mark Williams trade fell through, it probably put a cap on how far they could realistically go, where it feels like maybe against certain teams where you need a little bit more size and they're not going to have it,
Mhm.
they could still beat Minnesota for sure. And you're not going to say, oh, Mark Williams is the difference in this series at all. It's just like, it just feels kind of glaring. But like both you and I said, I think they'll be better.
Yeah, they'll be all right.
Then we have another game, Clippers Nuggets. This was another marquee one, with the Denver Nuggets winning in overtime. We picked the Nuggets to win this game. It got scary. It felt like they were going to lose this game, but they ended up pulling it out. And you look around, Jokic did his usual thing with 29, 9, and 12. Aaron Gordon had a huge game, 25 and 8. And then Jamal Murray with 21, 9, and 7. Shot 7 for 20 and hit some big shots. It felt like he shot like 20%
I know.
at different points, but, it felt like it was worse, but
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe it wasn't. But the unsung hero of this game, or probably sung by this point, was Russ, who had 15 points, 8 rebounds, 3 assists, 2 steals, and a bunch of key plays. Big offensive rebounds, both from him and Aaron Gordon. What could have been dagger corner 3.
Yeah.
Quite a roller coaster, right? Where he hits the go-ahead dagger corner 3.
Mhm.
Then, I think Harden gets the floater, right, to tie it up. He had a lot of those in this game. And then Russ had just a possession where I don't even know what happened. He just tossed the ball off the Clippers defense and they just went into overtime. So that was pretty awful. And then he made up for it in overtime. So he did a good job in terms of, like, this is kind of the experience you get. When you think about it, if you're the Clippers, it's weird because it feels like you definitely blew this game and it's pretty disappointing. But then you also look at it and you're like, hey, man, if you're going to take 17 shots, if you're Russell Westbrook, like, we're okay with that. We're okay with him, with funneling more shots towards him and just kind of, banking on him not being able to hit big shots. He did. But just as a whole, they left him very wide open, which was kind of crazy. And it's funny because we talked about with Denver the 3-point shooting, because the issues for them this season have been the defense, the 3-point shooting, and the lack of depth. And they shot 33% from 3, 9 for 27. So that's not amazing. And then, you look at the depth. Again, Russ helped, but no one else really off the bench was able to do much. And then the defense, because in the first half, the defense was just atrocious. I mean, it was just like, everybody was commenting, even on TV about it, right? How, even like with Jokic, his defense was just abysmal, where guys were just kind of getting into the paint, just getting right by him, just kind of just free eats around the rim. And it just felt very disappointing. But then in the second half, I thought he did a significantly better job. He got some steals, he broke up some shots around the basket, and he was able to kind of deliver when they needed him to do it. The other key story was Michael Porter Jr. because the big reason why Russ was in there at the end of the game was because Michael Porter Jr. was absolutely abysmal. He had 3 points and 4 rebounds, 1 for 4, only 27 minutes. Like you almost didn't even realize he wasn't out there, but it was even worse than that. And it was that was pretty disappointing from the perspective of you feel like he needs to be an impactful player for the Nuggets to be able to get as far as they can be. Because you just don't, even though Russ saved the day, you don't love the idea of we have to hope and pray that this guy hits some big shots in order to win this game. Because you just don't want to be in that situation. And then, you look over at the Clippers side, and hey, you got 32 and 11 from Harden. He played great, and it didn't feel like there was like a whole lot that the Nuggets could really do against him. Like it felt like he could just get wherever he wanted and did whatever he wanted. So maybe his performance might be sustainable because we know he has series and postseason moments that are not great, but it does feel like he can do this against this Denver team. Zubac played pretty well, 21 and 13, 10 of 15. He, kind of provided a foil for Jokic, right, where he was able to, play well. We know he plays really well against him. And then Kawhi, right, with 22, 6 and 3, 9 of 15 from the field. The issue with him was the turnovers, and that was the issue for the Clippers, was the fact that they had 20 turnovers in the game, and they gave up a ton of offensive rebounds in the fourth quarter and the overtime. And it's tough, because if you're the Clippers, you probably feel like you should have won this game and you blew it, and now you're down 0-1, and that was kind of the game that you want to steal. But at the same time, if you're Denver, you feel like, man, we feel like we just kind of like, got lucky on that one, and they still won the game. But I think the Clippers can still bounce back, even though I do have the Nuggets winning this series. But this game lived up to the hype, and it showed why, most people believe this is going to be a 7-game series. Like this, to me, really does feel like a coin flip of a series. It's going to come down to some of these other role players showing up, because if Michael Porter Jr. can be better, that could edge it towards Denver. But if Norman Powell doesn't have a stinker again and he plays better, that could move it back towards the Clippers. And then you look at the Clippers bench outside of Batum, not a ton of production. Maybe you could play Derek Jones Jr. more, but the other guys, Bogdanovich didn't really do anything and got hunted on defense. And then Ben Simmons, he's just kind of out there just while, like to save time while Zubac is out. You know what I mean? Like, he's not really a solution. Like, he's a big guy. Like, they had him on Jokic a couple of times, and I guess he was physical. But it just feels like you're just kind of, playing Russian roulette with him out there. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, and then with Chris Dunn, he was 2 of 5 from 3. That's a guy the Nuggets are going to leave open. He had a big 3 that he had to hit late in the game, and he didn't hit it. So I think it's going to come down to stuff like that. But, again, like, the Nuggets won the game, but I didn't feel like, amazing. It felt more like, I was relieved that they won, so that way our pick might actually come to fruition. But it's going to be tough. Like I said, I think this is going to go the distance.
Yeah, this is how the series is going to be. Most likely every game is going to be pretty close like this. I'm sure the result will vary on the night. But the Clippers completely gave this game away, like you said. You're not going to win a playoff game with 20 turnovers. And the other team only has 11, and I think that speaks volumes because you got, some great, phenomenal production, from James Harden. It really feels like a complete waste, of a performance because, you lost and Harden popped off. Zubac, did his thing as well. Kawhi, I think he's a guy you can call on. We already know he's Mr. Reliable, but, in terms of the turnovers, that's where you really just, like, bro, what are we doing? Like, how do we lose this game? And you can only really look at the turnovers because I think they played, solid defense. But then, you look at the Nuggets and they kind of got everything that they probably wanted in terms of, production from all their guys except for Michael Porter Jr. But then you have Russell Westbrook. And I've actually been seeing the funniest meme where people have been calling him, I think, the mystery box from Mario Kart because you don't know what you're going to get from him. Like, he could have a game like this where very inefficient, 5 for 17, but he makes up for it in so many other ways, outside of scoring and stuff like that. So, overall, great performance from Denver in terms of holding on. And, Jamal Murray is always going to be the X factor with this team. If he shows up in the way that he did tonight. Like you said, 7 for 20 doesn't look great, and it definitely felt worse because I think of the amount of missed mid ranges that we saw from him. I think that was where it was like that felt like his 10th, missed mid range in a row. But big shot taker, big shot maker, and that's what he does. He lives for those moments, and as long as he can hit those shots, Jokic has a good stat line. Aaron Gordon shows up on both ends of the floor, and you get something from either Russ or Michael Porter Jr., you're always going to be in the game. I think it's a matter of, can they slow down James Harden next game? Can they limit what Kawhi does on a night-to-night basis? Zubac, what does he look like in game 2 as well? And, do the Clippers turn the ball over 20 times again? I don't think so, but I think they will continue to lose the turnover battle, which might cost them the series, and I think that's going to be the key is the Clippers have to win the turnover battle in order to win this series.
Yeah, exactly. Because like you said with Jamal Murray, he missed a lot of mid-ranges, and the Clippers do have a lot of guys that they can throw at him to slow him down. But like you said, he kind of made up for it from the three-point line where he was 3 for 7, including a couple of big threes, like he said, to keep Denver in and then, put them up. So, yeah, again, this was the series that most people targeted as the one that's most likely to go 7 because it feels like both teams are very good. Like, it feels like the Clippers may be better, or at least they've been playing better basketball. Yes. But I think with the Nuggets, like, because they still have Jokic and they still have some of these guys around him, they can still win this series. It doesn't feel like this is an unwinnable series for Denver. But, I think the Clippers, aside from the turnovers, it feels like they have lived up to the hype. In the last couple of months, everybody's been talking about them as like a sleeper contender. But again, they're going to have to get past the Denver Nuggets, who, even in a state where it feels like they're at their weakest, they're still a very formidable team. So, again, game 2, I don't know. I mean, like you said, because it could go a couple of ways because, the Nuggets could kind of do what they did in this game, but maybe somebody shoots a little bit better. Maybe Porter's a little bit better and they pull it off. And then the Clippers still turn the ball over, but then maybe the Clippers execute a little bit better. Maybe some of their guys play better and, pull it out. We have the Nuggets winning in 7. So I think, we kind of anticipate that the Nuggets will probably hold on, and maybe win this next game.
Yep.
But yeah, this one is a tough one to figure out, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then moving on, after that, most of the other games I would say, were like kind of in the next tier. Right? I mean, I guess like you did have the Pistons-Knicks game. That one I think was probably the best one after all the ones we talked about, right? Where the Pistons were actually up for the vast majority of the game. And it got kind of scary for the Knicks at different points because, Jalen Brunson was shooting the ball pretty poorly. Obviously, he had recently come back from his ankle injury. So obviously that's something to think about because he did have a couple moments where it looked like he may have re-aggravated it. But then in the second half, especially in the fourth quarter, the Knicks and the Pistons showed why they're, why most people favored the Knicks to win the series. Because the Pistons, their veteran guys played well for most of the game. But then they just, the team as a whole just imploded in the fourth. A ton of turnovers, a ton of giveaways, just a lot of really poor decisions, missed shots that were going in the first 3 quarters but didn't go in the fourth. And then the Knicks basically went on a 21-0 run to seal the game. And all their guys at different points showed up, right? Like Mikal Bridges was, I think, probably the worst guy in the starting 5. Minus 16 in a game that the Knicks won by 11. But I don't think he was out there when the Knicks made that initial run. So I think that's, part of it. And he wasn't that great. But, Brunson ended up playing very well in the fourth to, get them the game 34-8. Towns, started slow in the first quarter, but I thought had a really good game. And I think, a really good debut showing in terms of, a lot of the things he can do and why the Knicks wanted him, right? With 23 points, 11 rebounds, 4 steals and 2 blocks, but also 5 assists because he had a lot of plays where he looked, pretty composed and made some good passes and didn't really force a lot of shots, right? He kind of took what was given to him because the Pistons took away a lot of his 3-point attempts that he could have had, but he made up for it by getting to the basket. And, some of the shots felt kind of weird, but, again, we know he's capable of driving to the basket and getting some shots around the rim. So pretty good game from both of those guys. OG Anunoby with 23 and 7 and 5 steals, 2 blocks. The main defender on Cade Cunningham did a pretty good job for most of the game. Josh Hart with his usual, versatile balance scoring. And then off the bench, Cameron Payne with 14, most of that in the fourth quarter to spark the run. And then Mitchell Robinson, he was a -9, but, did contribute at least on the boards, had a couple of blocks, some offensive rebounds, had a decent stretch where you saw him and Towns play together. It was kind of out of necessity because Hart was in foul trouble early on. But for the Knicks, like I said, it kind of showed why. As long as the Knicks' main guys play pretty well, they should win this series because I think they're the better team, and I just think there's a talent advantage. But the Pistons gave them a fight. So could there be a game where maybe Cade Cunningham is better? He had 21 and 12, but also 6 turnovers and 8 for 21. But a lot of the veteran guys played pretty well. Tim Hardaway Jr. had 19, Malik Beasley had 20, Tobias Harris had like 20 in the first half, and then I think only like 3 the rest of the way. But I just think as a whole, it just feels like the Knicks are better. And, again, we picked the Knicks to win in 6. It could be shorter if the Pistons, just kind of fumble away, crunch time moments against this team. But, I think the Pistons could have a hot shooting night. But overall, solid game. Because, like I said, I thought the Pistons played well for most of it. But I think the Knicks showed, why, even though they're not looked at in the same tier as, say, Boston and Cleveland, they're still a really good team.
Yeah, 100%. And, this game and this series is probably going to show a lot of people why I did pick the Knicks to win the title. They have a lot of personnel. The first key to victory was taking Cade out of the game, and they did exactly that. They threw a double no matter who it was. Sometimes you saw Jalen Brunson and OG Anunoby on Cade Cunningham, and they'll live with that because they're going to give Malik Beasley threes. They're going to give Tobias Harris all the shots in the world because they're not going to lose to, Cade Cunningham popping off, and that's going to be, their key to victory because as long as you limit, Cade, I think you'll be okay with, the potential inconsistent play that you're going to get from a lot of the role players because they don't really have another guy that can simply really just take over a game at any point like Cade can. And I think that's going to be the key for them. And, offensively, Jalen Brunson had his struggles, but as long as he continues to heat up, that's only going to benefit the Knicks in positive ways. And, Cat had a great offensive game, ran him off the 3-point line and just went to town down low. No pun intended. He was on the boards as well, and he was passing, playmaking, doing everything that you possibly could really want from a versatile, stretch big like that. Mitchell Robinson, like you talked about, him playing is a huge factor as well because he adds, a level of physicality and rim protection that the team was really missing for the majority of the season. Cam Payne being the spark plug, that helps as well. You're going to need him, not necessarily to, I guess, show up nightly, but at least, have a positive impact and, potentially spark some of these runs coming off the bench. But yeah, I was thoroughly impressed, with OG Anunoby and what he was able to do on both ends of the floor. He's a definite swing piece. Mikal Bridges, not too impressed. Didn't really even play, his normal minutes, 29 minutes, but yeah, I mean, fouled a little bit here and there, but yeah, Cam Payne was really the guy who kind of came in and, did a lot of the Mikal Bridges damage and kind of saved him in my opinion. But, it's inexperience versus, a little bit of experience and talent. The Knicks are more of a talented team all around. Yes. You look at Detroit and what they've accomplished this season. It's great. You do have a guy who's going to be all NBA or should be with Cade Cunningham. But then outside of that, you love the progression of the young guys, but they're just not on New York's level at the moment. And, we'll see how the series shapes up to be. But, it should be fun. It should be physical. It had its moments in this game. But, if you're New York, I think you should be slightly worried considering the fact that you were down for majority of this game. But, you had a great fourth quarter.
Right, yeah. I think against this team, it'll be fine, right? Once you advance and play the better teams, that's where you might get a little bit concerned because it just feels like, the Bridges thing again, it sounds like a broken record, but they did give up a lot in order to get him. And it just feels like he's going to have to be better against some of the best teams. And it just feels like, in this game, was there really a reason for him to be ineffective? I mean, it just feels like there probably shouldn't be. But
I agree.
He may just not be the guy that they were hoping for, but it won't hurt him against this series. We'll see what it looks like, I think when they move on to the next series, because I do think they're going to win this series. Yeah. Like I said, if Jaden Ivey was there, maybe it's a different story. You would still probably pick the Knicks to win because I still think they'd be more talented. But I just think you'd have more defensively to worry about just because of, what he can do. Whereas, you're kind of just banking on Tobias Harris, Tim Hardaway Jr., Malik Beasley getting hot from three,
Yeah.
which can happen because it did in this game. But is that going to happen 4 out of 7 times and then Cade does what he wants? Like, probably not. I just think the Knicks are just, this is kind of one of the situations where it's like, no excuses to lose this series. Like, I think they're going to win it,
Yeah,
and
I
they
agree.
should.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Then moving on, rest of the games, a little bit more run of the mill, but obviously we're still going to talk about them. Bucks Pacers. This was one that I think we may just have to admit we whiffed on. Obviously, there's reports that Lillard, I think, has been upgraded to questionable for Game 2. So we'll see if he plays because they think he's going to play in one of the next couple of games. But, the Pacers blew him out 117-98 to take a 1-0 series lead against the Bucks. And pretty much for the reasons why most people pick the Pacers to win the series. Because as awesome as Giannis is, he's one man. He had 36 and 12. But then you look at the rest of the group, and it was pretty horrible. You had two guys in Torian Prince and Kyle Kuzma that had 0 points. I believe Kuzma had zeros completely across the board,
Yep.
as outside of fouls. I guess he had 2 fouls, but just that can't happen if you're the Bucks. But the problem is it gonna get that much better? I mean, it could, but it feels like they're so limited offensively with what they can do. Versus you look over at Indiana, which is why all of us, including why a lot of people, including us, like we picked the Bucks to win, but we felt like that the Pacers were the better team because of the fact that like all the talent that they have. And even defensively, they have improved. They made it tough for the Bucks. Like there were a decent amount of shots where you're like, "Oh, you could have made that." But as a whole, that's all that the Bucks can really do. They have to bank on, some hot 3-point shooting. If Lillard isn't there. I think the hope is Lillard can come back and give you somebody that you have to guard, and then that just has a trickle down effect and then just kind of opens everything up for everyone else. But it's just hard to bank on him getting back to what he was before, the situation he had. Could it happen? Maybe, but it's tough to bank on it and it may be too late. Obviously, it's one game. So, it's not the end of the world, but what we saw from the Pacers feels pretty sustainable. Like it feels like they can do this. Like Halliburton didn't even have a crazy scoring game, but he did everything else you would have liked. He shot 3 for 13, but still had 12 assists and 7 rebounds and, created great shots for everyone. And Andrew Nembhard at 17, seemingly rising in the playoffs again, right? Miles Turner at 19, Pascal Siakam at 25. Then you had McConnell and Mathurin off the bench in double figures. So it just feels like if that's kind of like the floor of what you're going to get, like then they're probably going to win this series. Like, will they have 50 from the field and 38 from 3 every game? Maybe not, but they may not need to because I just think, if Lillard either isn't playing or isn't close to 100%, the Bucks just probably don't have enough. And I think, like I said, this is one where we may have to admit that we probably whiffed on it.
Yeah, it doesn't look like, our pick for the Bucks winning this series has kind of come to fruition. I think there, there's a lot stacked up against them, like you already talked about. I don't really need to reread the stat lines, but we were kind of half right. We predicted that Giannis would go off in this series, but we also predicted that the Bucks would win. And right now it's, more of a half truth kind of thing. So, and Indiana, you have to tip your hat to them because pretty much off rip, in the first quarter, you pretty much knew that the game was over,
Yeah.
Yeah, Nebhard was really just taking it to the basket every time, converting on every look. And then, even defensively, like they really just took everybody away, obviously outside of Giannis. But, like Benedict Mathurin's, defensive motor, very strong. He got to the line a lot. And, you even look at how many guys they played. Granted, they were up for the entire game. So, that might be skewed a little bit, but they're deep. These are all guys that I think can play, probably outside of maybe like Thomas Bryant and maybe Johnny Furphy. But, the rest of them gave you quality, solid minutes and, kept their foot, on the gas. And I think that's the key where, if some of their guys do end up running out of gas a little bit, maybe later down the line in this series or, the following one, they have some solid replacements where you don't really feel like there's a steep drop off in terms of impact. And I think that's what makes this team super special because, like you talked about, Halliburton had a horrible game in terms of efficiency from the field, but, also doing all the other right things, defensively, swinging the ball, but you got so much production elsewhere. Like Siakam was balling out, Miles Turner solid, and that's going to be a key, I think, for Indiana. Can Miles Turner hit the three ball efficiently? I think that's going to be something where I'm watching that because I feel like if he doesn't hit the three ball efficiently, the Bucks might have a chance because they might start sagging off, and that might crowd the paint and limit what, say, like a guy Siakam, Halliburton, Nebhard even could really do. So I mean, there is a slight pathway for the Bucks to win the series if Dame comes back, but it's clear and evident that you need Dame in this lineup to win.
Yeah, and again, like the mark of a good team is kind of also like, hey, can you win if your best player doesn't have to have a crazy game?
Sure.
And like, yeah, if Halliburton doesn't have to have a crazy offensive game in order for the Pacers to win, because like you said, they have so much depth and their defense has improved. So
That too.
it like again, it's one game, but it does feel like the Pacers have the upper hand in the series, and unless Dame can come back and be a superhero, the Pacers are probably going to take this one, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Then moving on to some of the other games, we had Orlando and Boston, right? And so this is kind of where you start getting into the games that were a little bit, different from the other ones. Now, in fairness, first half, pretty good. The Magic actually had the lead in the first half.
Mm-hmm.
They actually outshot the Celtics from three, and Paolo looked awesome, right? Franz, 23-5, 3-point shot, very disappointing, unfortunately, because he had a stretch for a while earlier this season where his three ball was fine, and then all of a sudden now it's back to he just can't shoot anymore. Still did a lot of other things, but for Orlando, the real story is Paolo, where it looks like this looks like a guy, from the perspective of this is a guy that you can, clearly see he can be one of the best players on the floor in a playoff season. We saw some of it last year, but he was really good in this game. And part of it was the jump shot, because that's kind of the thing for him is like, he was 4 of 7 from 3, 14 of 27. Not every shot was like just a bullying drive to the basket. There were a lot of, tough shots that he took and made. But like you mentioned, from a Rockets perspective offensively, the Magic are also very bad offensively as
Horrible.
well, right? Like
they're
and
worse.
they actually shot. Yeah, they're worse. Because of everyone else, right? Like you just don't really have enough offensive talent on the rest of the roster, and you're just kind of banking on some guys just being decent, and they're not always going to be that offensively. Like Anthony Black, great in the play-in game against the Hawks, but guess what? In this game, 3 points, 1 of 4 from the field, minus 15. Cole Anthony, hero in the play-in game, not too much in this game. And obviously there's a difference because like the Celtics are also a much better team. So that's part of it as well. But just from the perspective of Orlando, it's just, again, it just sucks for them that like the season went the way that it did. Even before Jalen Suggs got hurt, they were terrible offensively, and they're still horrible on offense. And it feels like that's what's going to have to be better. And like it's another team like the Rockets where it just feels like you're going to have to find somebody in the summer that, can help you offensively from the perimeter, if you want any chance of keeping up with the rest of these teams. And then from Boston's perspective, just more of the same. And it was actually funny because none of the stars really played that great offensively. Like, Jaylen Brown, who I think, it seems like he's got a knee thing going on. He seemed like he wasn't quite as agile or athletic this game. Like there were a lot of drives where it just felt like he wasn't the same guy, which we kind of knew going in. Still 6 of 14 from the field, but that's something to look out for. Tatum, 14 rebounds, 4 assists, 8 for 22 from the field, 1 of 8 from 3. Had a play where he hurt his wrist. He got fouled. I think they called a flagrant foul. Didn't need to be a flagrant foul. Just kind of a hard foul, but just something to look at. And then Porzingis, 1 of 8 from the field, but he did have 4 steals and a block. But then this is the problem playing against a team like Boston is Derek White, 30 points, 7 of 12 from 3. Drew Holiday, back, right? Where like he was pretty quiet for most of the season. And then only had 9 points, but 3 of 4 from three, and a lot of really loud plays in a good way, right? 5 assists, 3 steals, and then Al Horford, right? And Peyton Pritchard, that's the other guy, because that was a guy where last year for the Celtics in the postseason, he didn't really do quite as much. Like, he had his moments, but he didn't really come in and necessarily change the game a ton. And as the playoffs went on, didn't really do much. Hit some of those half court bombs against the Mavs, but it was kind of just like gravy as opposed to like they needed it. But
Sure.
in this game, they needed his production. And he gave it to them, right? He was able to get to different places on the floor, 4 of 6 from three, and even held up defensively because Orlando's a big physical team. Like, the funny thing with the Magic is, like the Rockets, they're a great defensive team. I believe they're second in the league in defensive rating, but the problem for them is they can't score, and it's just absolutely abysmal outside of hoping and praying that Paolo and Franz play really well. And Paolo was awesome. Franz was a tier below that because the jump shot just wasn't falling. But then you look at everyone else, and they were just abysmal. I think Jonathan Isaac was the third leading scorer, and even he had only like 7 points. And that should, like, he can't be the third leading scorer for them, right? But you just look around and it's like, who can you turn to? Like, there's not really anybody else you can look to for offense. Whereas with the Celtics, their best guys didn't even really play well offensively, and then they still had a 30-point scorer in Derek White. So, and then a guy off the bench, and that's just the problem for the Magic, and that's why it's tough to like believe that they have any chance of winning this series. Which is why, I think you said sweep, or did you say 5? You said sweep. I said 5. They're not going to win probably more than one game because this was kind of the game that they could have taken if the second half had gone like the first half. But it just feels like with the Celtics, they just have more options, and like that's why they're considered one of the favorites to win it all, because even in a game where all of their best players offensively weren't that good, they have other guys that can pretty much just step right in and just be like, we got you.
Yeah.
And Orlando doesn't have that. And, without Jalen Suggs, they definitely don't have it.
Yeah. I mean, it comes down to productivity and depth, like you talked about. Jason Tatum didn't have the greatest game offensively, but that's why he's one of the better players in the league, because he still gave you 14 rebounds and did all the other little stuff,
Yep.
And you have a guy like Peyton Pritchard coming off the bench, and he might be, like a fringe starter on another playoff team if he was elsewhere. So, that's where I think, a lot of people are still confident about Boston. They're coming off the title. I think they're expected to win this series, handedly. I don't really know anybody who picked really the Magic, maybe outside of like Magic fans, and that might even be a little bit of a stretch. But yeah, like you talked about, this is great experience, for the Magic. I think it's a great experience for Paolo. He needs this. He needs to be in a 7-game series against top tier talent, because we need to see how does he match up against it. Does he kind of disappear and fade away, or does he rise to the occasion? Because this is one of those years where we need to see him, elevate. Can he be, the number one option on a playoff team? And I think so far the answer is yes. It's only been one game, but it's a phenomenal game. He's one of the better, games, individual performances that we've seen in the playoffs, through the game ones. And, solid, very solid, like you said, efficiently shooting the ball, using his body for once. Because I think the problem that I had with Paolo, as great of a player as he is, he used to settle for mid-ranges that were very unnecessary when you could pretty much just use your body and frame to get to the rack, or even create more separation, with your body. But that's neither here nor there because he popped off. But yeah, I think Boston's going to sweep this team. They just don't have another guy like you talked about. And I think, Orlando's going to have some questions, right? Like, do you really want to move forward with, Cole Anthony, Anthony Black, guys like that? They're young guys. I think they have a ton of upside, on certain aspects of their game. But I think if you have a guy like Corey Joseph who starts instead of one of them, that speaks kind of volumes towards, where they are in their development, and the lack of trust, I think. Because I think people looked at Orlando as a deep team, especially last year and maybe even this year. But, deep in terms of what, because I think there's Boston deep, and then there's Orlando deep, where you have some playable guys, but they don't match the productivity of your starters. So I think that's the key difference between these two teams, obviously outside of talent discrepancy. But, yeah, Boston's going to sweep this one.
Yeah. Then moving on, Heat Cavs.
Oh, boy.
Another one that was kind of just like, what you expected. Now, in fairness to the Heat, they competed for a decent stretch of this game. Like, they were never down by like a bajillion points. But again, it's just kind of another thing where like the talent eventually is going to win out. Tyler Hero, I guess, for the Heat at 21, 7 of 18. Bam at 24. But, again, Davion Mitchell 18, but just not enough really to be able to, I think, win this series. This is the one that I felt like was the most likely to be a sweep. And you look over at the Cavs roster and you'll see why. Donovan Mitchell and Darius Garland, right, both had great offensive performances, super efficient. They don't really have Miami doesn't really have like guys that can really guard them. I mean, with Mitchell, he's not tall, but he's a big physical guard, right? So, and super athletic. And Davion Mitchell's probably your best option. Maybe Wiggins is the other one, but just, he's really good. Like, and he's a tough guy to guard. Garland, not as physical or as big, but still very quick, very skilled, right? Pull-up jump shooter guy. And that's kind of the tough part of guarding, a backcourt like this, is not only can they both score around the basket, it's a little bit different because Mitchell can bully his way or, be a great athlete and finish, whereas Garland's more like finesse, floaters. But they're both also, pull-up jump shooters. And it's just tough to play against a team like that as a backcourt. And then they still have bigs that they can kind of find ways to get things done. Like Jared Allen had 12 and 11 with 3 steals and a block. Mobley was there, right? But, like, didn't really do a whole lot, I felt like. But you didn't really need him in this game. Like, this is not a series where you're like, Evan Mobley has to be on his A game. But it's just kind of something to put in your back pocket because you're just thinking, like, once they play more serious competition, like, presumably they're going to play the winner of, they're going to play the winner of the Pacers-Bucks. You're going to need him to be better against those teams.
Yeah.
But, again, kind of the bare minimum. And then, of course, Ty Jerome off the bench was also the other guy. And this was kind of a guy that was, I think, really interesting to think about because he had a really good regular season for them. And there were a lot of games where he was coming off the bench and saving them, right? Where like, I mean, of course he's also a luxury, but just, it felt like when he plays well, it made them really tough on the offensive end. And that's their strength, is their offense. And he had 28 off the bench in a playoff debut, 5 of 8 from 3, used his physicality also too, right? Like had multiple flexes in the game where he was just kind of bullying Miami's guards because he's a big guard, right? He's like 6'5" and not really skinny. Not huge, right? But like a relatively big guard. And I thought, if you're going to get that from him, that's big time because then that's a guy that, Cleveland hasn't had in the previous postseasons where they didn't have a guy off the bench that could really give them any sustainable level of offensive impact. It was more so like a guy like a Sam Merrill, right? Or, who is a 3-point shooter and kind of just that. Like, he's not a guy that you can be like, you're a 6-man bench scoring type guy, right? And the Cavs have that now with Jerome. Hunter didn't really do a whole lot either, but this was a game where, again, you don't have to have everybody play great. This is a team where you can kind of just get by based off your talent, and that's kind of all there is to it, right? Like for the Heat, it's nice to see some of those guys, I guess, get more playoff experience, especially because now that there's no more Jimmy, like those guys are going to be the key guys that teams are targeting, but I just don't think they have quite enough to be able to get it done. And this, not really like a disappointment, not a shocker. This was a 10 seed, right? But against one of the best teams in the league. And I think for the Cavs, in the fourth quarter, they pulled away, and that's all they needed to do. Like, they didn't have to come in and blow the team out by 30 points in the first quarter, but like another team that we'll get to eventually. But they just kind of had to survive and just needed to play well and do their thing. And at a certain point, the Heat were going to run out of gas, and then that was that. So a good opening game for the Cavs and kind of a nice way to get into the playoffs, right? Where you don't have to stress and play a tough team. Like the Heat are going to try to make it competitive, but this was, like I said, this is the one that I felt the most confident in being a sweep. Maybe Miami could get hot from 3 and have a good 3-point shooting game, but they still shot like 42% from 3. And also the Cavs can get hot from 3 too. They shot even better. They hit 18 out of 43 threes. And again, that's one of the big strengths for the Cavs is the 3-point shooting. And if that continues, like, they are going to be a problem. Like, and we'll see what it looks like when they go deeper into the playoffs. But, again, fine.
Yeah, speaking of depth, like, the Cavs are the definition of that as well. They have a guy
Yeah.
like Ty Jerome that can clearly pop off at any given moment. You have a Sam Merrill, very similar skill set, to a guy like Sam Hauser. Both are
Mhm.
knockdown 3-point shooters. You have Isaac Okoro, DeAndre Hunter, very solid, wings, two-way wings, and that's going to be the key to success is, down the line, can those guys show up and continue to show up when you need them? Because I think at this point, Darius Garland is a guaranteed bucket. Donovan Mitchell, guaranteed bucket. Jared Allen can do things on both ends of the floor. Evan Mobley needs to do both, things on both ends of the floor. Didn't really see it in this game, in my opinion, but because I think he's the huge, key swing piece outside of Garland. Because if Garland, has a bad series down the line, then I think you automatically lose. But same thing with
Yeah.
Evan Mobley. Like, they can't both be bad. One of them has to pop off, and I think we'll see where that goes. But I not really too much to say here from my perspective. I think this is going to be a sweep, to be honest. And yeah, I mean, that's really all I have to say. I think they're too
Yeah.
deep, and the talent discrepancy is there. Best case scenario, for the Cavs, because this is exactly what you want. I think you want to go into a series, obviously, against one of the worst teams in the playoffs, and it's a great way to shake off the rust, I think, because they didn't really finish the season super strong. And I think this is a good way to gain
Right.
that confidence back, gain back the mojo
Yeah.
that they had been, running with the entire season and what made them so magical. And I think, they're going to get that back once they sweep this team. Pack them
Yeah,
boys
and
out.
that's a great point because they play 10 guys, and like you said, they finished the season rough a little bit around the edges, mainly on the defensive end. And that's kind of, that was kind of one of the reasons why the Heat were able to stick around for as long as they did,
Mhm.
because they were able to kind of keep pace with them offensively. But then eventually, yeah, then the Cavs turned it up. And that's the thing is like they play 10 guys, and a couple, you got a couple stinkers off the bench, but then a couple of guys who were good. Like Ty Jerome was great, and that kind of makes up for the lack of what you got from guys like Isaac Okoro and DeAndre Hunter, who were both scoreless and 0 for 4. But again, like you said, this is kind of a best case scenario for the Cavs, where, like you said, you get to play a weak team that doesn't really have any chance in beating you,
Mhm.
but it allows you to shake the rust off and get into playoff mode so that way, once you start playing the better teams, then guys will be in a rhythm. They'll have been adjusted to at least some form of playoff basketball, and then they'll be ready for the bigger challenges ahead, right? Like even with the way the Cavs played the latter part of the season, I'm still high on this team, and I still feel like it's them and Boston in the East. But again, this is not going to work, I think, against the better teams. But you're not playing those teams right now, so
Yeah,
you don't have to. And I think there's a better version of this because, like you said,
100%.
Mobley was not great in this game, but I think he can have a bigger game than this. It doesn't have to be in this series because of the talent, but just but then Garland and Mitchell, if both of those guys play well, you're in a good spot because, like you said, at least one of those two guys needs to be really good for them to have a chance of winning a game and a series.
Yeah.
Like you said, if one of them is awful, right? Which Mobley wasn't great, but he probably wasn't like completely
No, he wasn't
awful. Like,
unplayable.
yeah, like if one of those guys is atrocious, then yeah, you're probably losing against a better team. But
Hmm.
this is fine. Like you
Yeah.
said, this is what you want.
Yeah.
Then moving on, last but not least, a beatdown, a belt of epic proportions. It
BTA,
was,
man.
yeah, it was pretty brutal, honestly. And this was one where, like I said, I thought maybe it goes 5. Of course, we'll see. Because I mean, you think you couldn't have as bad of a game again, right? But you just look at Oklahoma City. You know which game I'm talking about. Didn't even have to say the team, but 131-80. They were up by more than 50. At one point, you were kind of wondering, like, could they actually double up the score? Like, could they actually, like, because I think, like, at one point it was like, I don't know, like 50 to 100 something. Like you were thinking, like, is there a possibility we might see them win by double the margin of
Mhm.
points? And it didn't happen because of garbage time and whatnot. But either way, OKC showed in this game. I think we saw two things. You saw one, why so many people are very high on Oklahoma City, especially from the defensive end of the floor, because of the fact that they completely shut off Memphis's water offensively. Nobody could really get anything going with any level of efficiency, I guess, except for Marvin Bagley, right? But
Marvin Bagley
outside of that,
legacy game.
Yeah, Ja Morant, 17 and 4, but 6 for 17, 1 of 6 from 3. Desmond Bain, 3 for 12. Jaren Jackson Jr., god awful, 2 for 13. Probably one of the worst playoff games that I've seen from him.
Mm-hmm.
And then Scottie Pippen Jr., 1 for 9.
Yep.
Pretty rough from him. Again, he's really not supposed to be in this situation because of the injuries to guys like Jalen Wells and Brandon Clark, but that's the situation you're in. I think Desmond Bain had a plus minus of minus 51, which I think is the worst ever in a playoff game. Pretty crazy to see that. But yeah, either way, yeah, not really anything good from Memphis. I think Josh said, like, we're not going to be that bad again. Maybe they're not going to be that bad again, but it's certainly, I mean, I don't know how much better it's going to be. Like, I don't expect OKC to win by 50 every game. I think there'll be at least some games where it'll be more competitive. But just as a whole, then you look around at OKC, SGA had probably his worst offensive performance of the season. He had 15, right? This is a guy that averaged, 33 a game?
Mm-hmm.
And this was, his worst offensive performance. And they still won by 50. He shot 4 for 13, 1 of 7 from 3. But then you look around, got contributions from everyone else. Hartenstein was awesome, 14, 8, and 5. Chet Holmgren was awesome, 19 and 10 with 2 blocks. Jalen Williams was great. That's kind of a guy that you're looking at where you'd like to see more from him. Not necessarily in this game, but just that's the guy that you're looking at as can he carry the load, especially when SJ isn't out there. This is going to be a breeze of a series for him because Memphis doesn't have any wings or forwards to really be able to stay in front of him or guard him.
Yeah.
So at the very least, it's good to get reps, and we'll see what he looks like against, more serious competition. But then you even look at the bench. Aaron Wiggins, 21 off the bench. Jalen Williams, right? Jay Will with 9, actually hitting some threes, which I think is kind of a nice thing to see. Caruso didn't score, but had 3 rebounds and 4 assists. Cason Wallace. Again, you didn't really need a ton of scoring from a ton of guys because you won by 50 and held Memphis to 80. But the thing for OKC is the 3-point shot, because if they do knock those down, that makes them even more tough to stop because we know defensively what they can do. But I think most of the questions people have about OKC is on the offensive end of the floor. Can you trust the non-SGA guys to get things done on the offensive end? Can you look to them for some level of offense? Because it can't just be SGA dominating. And again, they're not going to win every game by 50. But just as a whole, you liked what you saw from OKC. It was a good game. They played pretty well from that perspective. And then from the other side with Memphis, it's just rough, just completely brutal because of the fact that they were really good at one time earlier this season, right? At one time, it may be tough to believe, but they were one of the top teams in the Western Conference. And, even then, they're still 14 games above 500. So it's not like it's a terrible team. But just, they've been on a complete downward trajectory. And they just, outside of, when they play bad teams, they've stunk. And it's just kind of concerning because at one time, this felt like one of the potential risers in the Western Conference in terms of their young core. But now, once they get wiped off the floor by the end of this series, however, short it is, because it won't be a long series, I don't think. But then you're just kind of left with questions where you're like, what the heck happened? I don't know what they're going to do, but say, Jaren Jackson Jr. is going to be up for an extension. And he did have a great regular season, but, he has not lived up to the hype in these last few games. And it feels like he shouldn't be this bad. Against Golden State, you don't really look at anybody and feel like, oh yeah, this is an obvious guy that's going to slow down Jaren Jackson Jr. And they did. Then in this game, you're like, well, maybe it couldn't get any worse. And then it is worse. Now, obviously, OKC is, elite defensively. That's what they do. But you still feel like, if a guy can play in the post, that feels like the type of guy that should be able to score against Oklahoma City. Like a guy that's big and strong and can score in the post. That feels like the type of guy that can, at least do some level of damage. But you just didn't see that. And again, I don't want to just completely harp on him because it wasn't like he was the only bad player in this series or in this game. But I don't know. It's just rough. Because it just feels like Memphis had a strong start to the season, but they've completely underachieved the rest of the way. And I don't know what the future of this team is going to be. My hope, at least, is that maybe they kind of find some other supporting guys next to them. but I have no clue because like again, this team won almost 50 games, so it's not like they stink. It's not like it's Cleveland versus Miami where that's a team that didn't even win 40 games. They had a losing record. This was a team that was 15 games above 500, and just to see them just get completely trounced against a lot of the better teams as of late. It's kind of disheartening, especially if you're a Grizzlies fan. Like, that's got to be a terrible feeling. But for OKC, it's a pretty wild introduction to what this team could potentially be in the playoffs.
Yeah, first of all, that environment, I don't know how anybody's going to win and steal a game in Oklahoma City. That environment is off the charts. That's number one. So shout out to all the fans in Oklahoma City. Yeah, but the depth that this team has on both ends of the floor is ridiculous. In terms of Oklahoma City, there's a reason why we have them coming out of the Western Conference. I think this series is going to be a breeze. We already talked about that. I think this is going to be a sweep for sure. They're just able to be pesky against anybody and anyone. Like you talked about, like Jaren Jackson Jr. You would think a guy like that at that height and his size. Yeah, he could easily have a efficient double at the very least. Yeah, no, we don't do that over here. Like Chet, Zay, they were Hartenstein. They were just locking everything down, and even Lou Dort. I think that's a key guy, obviously. In terms of what he brings defensively, but now offensively too. Because I remember when he was first on that team. People left him wide open because he wasn't that good of a shooter, but now he's having a career year. That makes him dangerous. Chet being, a great three-point shooter as well. J-Dub, I think, being solid and versatile and being that second option. We already know what Shea can do, and he didn't even need to do it in this game, and they won by so much. I'm still in utter disbelief. But yeah, Aaron Wiggins off the bench, they're so deep because a lot of these guys would be starters on, other teams, and that's the scary part. Like, what if Isaiah Joe catches fire alongside Lou Dort, alongside Aaron Wiggins, Cason Wallace? Like, what can you really do at that point? And it's funny that Cason Wallace's only points, I think, was a freaking poster dunk that came out of nowhere. But it's stuff like that where the energy, the vibes are all high. They just have everything going for them. And then you look at Memphis, and they just didn't really have anything but a Marvin Bagley legacy game. And it's like, well, that doesn't amount to literally anything. So It has sweep written all over it. That's kind of what I predicted. I think Oklahoma City is going to probably breeze through up until the conference finals. I think that's where they'll meet, probably potentially their biggest challenge, because you're going to be going up against, some more experienced teams, some teams that have a little bit better high-end talent than Memphis and, that aren't beaten and battered, hopefully, fingers crossed, knock on wood. And yeah, like I said, there's a reason we picked them to come out of the West, and I know a lot of people were hating on this team, saying that they don't have it. I know it's one game and it's in the first round, but to do this is kind of crazy. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah. Does this hurt SGA's MVP?
Not at all. MVP is a regular season award.
Right.
It shows how good the team is. Yeah, I think it might somewhat lower his individual value, I guess, in terms of that perspective, but not really, because it's Memphis too. It'd be different if it was a higher caliber team. I would be like, okay, that's different. But here I'm just really blown away by the score. Really, I'm not really concerned about SG. I think he'll be fine. Like it really doesn't matter.
Yeah, and like you said, looking ahead potentially. We don't want to look too far ahead, obviously, but for OKC in terms of the bracket that they're on, they are in the bracket where they're going to play the winner of the Nuggets Clippers series, right? You expect that to probably be a long series. So whoever comes out of that, maybe a little bit, like you said, battered and bruised. Who knows? Hopefully they're fine. And then, like you said, they get to the conference finals where could be the Lakers, could be Minnesota, could be Golden State, could be Houston. Who knows, right? So we'll see. But like you said, for OKC, this is one of the reasons why, like you said, we picked them to win the West, because, like you said, it's not just the fact that they defend, but they're very deep, very talented, even though it's a very young team. And they do have a superstar. He wasn't a superstar in this game, but he doesn't need to be. It's an 8 seed, that has no chance of being able to really do much.
Right.
Again, like I said, it's funny because in the first quarter,
And he still
it
played
actually was.
defense. That's another thing I do want to add. He still was locking people up when he was out there.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Right. Yeah. And but it's funny because in the first quarter, this was a competitive game.
Yeah.
And it's funny because we've seen this from OKC a lot in the regular season where they'll have like stretches where like the other team is right there with them. And then eventually they just blow them away because they go on this big defensive oriented run where they just get stops, completely shut off the water for the other team, force turnovers, get out and run and score in transition. And that's what happens. And that's what happened in this game because it was like, this could be a scenario where like somebody could have, because it's Easter Sunday, so like somebody could have watched the first quarter or like watched the first half of the first quarter, go to the bathroom or start preparing meals or whatever. Then they come back like 10 minutes later and you're like, this is a 30-point game. What the heck just happened? And, that's the type of stuff that OKC can do. And like we said, we're not expecting them to win by 50 points every game, not even 20 points every game. But, we know that this is what, if you believe that this team can win the title, like we didn't have them winning the title, but we both had them making the finals, right? So, and it's in the Western Conference. So, you're going to have to play some really good teams. So, if you believe that they have a chance to do it, like then they got to show it by beating the tar out of a lot of these teams. Because even a team like Boston, like they did have luck in terms of injuries, but they blew everyone away in the playoffs last year. And they even blew away Dallas, right? Who, again, most people picked the Celtics to win, but most people expected that to be more competitive than it was. Sure. It wasn't even really that close. So, I think at the very least, I think you can still tell, like, it's one game. So, of course, for all these teams, so you don't want to overreact too much. But it still does feel like the three best teams in the regular season still feel like the three teams that are the most likely to win it all. And then you just kind of have to choose what you think the order is, whether or not you think it's Boston or OKC or Cleveland. But it does feel like those are the three teams. But I think there's at least, like you said, I think some of these other teams could challenge Oklahoma City. I just don't feel like I just don't feel comfortable picking them to win against Oklahoma City. That's the problem.
I agree.
Is, if you're going to make the case that OKC isn't going to make it, well, then you have to make the case who is it and why. And I just feel like with OKC, I think the depth, the defense, and the superstar talent, I think is what's going to win out. Even if, again, maybe they don't dominate through the postseason, because they are in the West. But, I think at the very least, like, I'd be pretty surprised if they didn't make the finals. Like, Western Conference finals for sure. And I think NBA finals, I think would be a little bit surprising. Because I just, some of these teams I think could give them more of a run, but they got to get there. Like, maybe a team like the Lakers could challenge Oklahoma City, but they got to get to the conference finals. Yeah. And there's no guarantee that they get there because they're not markedly better than any of the other teams around them. Whereas it feels like OKC is. And for a lot of these teams, it's matchup based, as we talked about, right? Like, but I think OKC can match up against most of these teams, right? Maybe a big physical team could give them some potential problems, like people have marked Denver. But, Denver may not make it alive out of this series. And even if they do, OKC could just blow them away because, they could force a bunch of turnovers and, dare some of the Nuggets guys to hit shots. And, who knows? We don't know what to expect. But like I said, I think at least so far from the first games of the playoffs, I think most of the top teams, by and large, lived up to the hype. But again, those seeds are also playing most of the weakest opponents in the playoffs. I think most people, even though Memphis has a good record, most people felt like of all the playoff teams, Memphis was the weakest one by a decent margin, even more so than Houston. Because with Houston, they have no playoff experience, but you at least felt like they feel like a tough-minded team that isn't just going to get completely punked. Whereas with Memphis, it just kind of feels like they're just kind of waiting until the season's over. Yeah. It just, again, it's rough considering where they looked, how they looked a couple seasons ago. But
yeah, they're confident. Their confidence just got killed. That's really what it comes down to.
Yeah. So, now moving on, I guess, to a couple of news rumors, not a whole lot to speak of, but we had something happen today. Before we got on to record, where it seems like Landry Fields, the GM for the Atlanta Hawks, is going to be out. He's going to be replaced. I think there's an interim guy, and then they're going to, I think, probably figure out how best to kind of, fill in the pieces around. But kind of odd, right? I guess from the perspective of, if you're Atlanta, you're let down by the fact that the second half of the season completely fell apart. You had injuries, right? So you have an excuse. But it was weird because it felt like you felt okay about the Hawks going forward. Like, you don't look at them as a title contender or like a crazy great team in the East, but you at least felt like, hey, if they're healthy, they got Trae Young, they got a bunch of athletic wings and size, and they should at least be okay. Like, maybe they're in the third tier where it's like somewhere between, I don't know, like 5 to 8 potentially. Which again, when you get closer to 8, that's kind of no man's land. But they had the potential to be a non-playing team if they were fully healthy. But obviously, with him out of the picture, that's got to mean there's probably at least some level of change that could be coming for the Atlanta Hawks. Could it come in the form of a Trae Young trade? Possibly, because we know whenever you replace the GM, it's no longer somebody where it's those are their guys. Like, they could, any of those guys could easily be moved. So I don't know what to expect from Atlanta. I haven't known what to expect from Atlanta in a while. But this one was a little surprising. But we did talk about, we're going to see as the playoffs go on, that's going to dictate what some of these teams do. Like, even the teams that are in the playoffs right now, we know if some of them go out early or if they go deep, that's going to impact what they decide to do. And for the Hawks, I guess they felt like, we don't like what we're seeing. And maybe they didn't feel like he was doing a great job. I don't know. But, what do you think of this?
I mean, I thought he did a solid job of, issuing some talent, to help, Trae Young out, because I think, we saw Dyson Daniels emerge on both ends of the floor. He looked like a viable option on offense, and we already knew that he was a very good defender, but he took a leap further than that. And then you had Jalen Johnson. He emerged. Reza Sher wasn't, a bust by any means. He was very solid, had a very good rookie campaign. But it just wasn't enough. Obviously, injuries played a factor too. But, I guess their thought process was, well, we have Trae Young. He should probably keep us afloat. And that kind of happened, kind of didn't. I mean, we talked about it in our live stream. One of our viewers actually said the play-in completely screwed the Hawks. And I think that's what, it really comes down to, is like the play-in. They lost in the play-in. And, if they didn't lose in the play-in, we'd probably be having a different conversation. And, obviously the GM probably wouldn't be fired. But I guess the big question mark is, like, what do you do with Trae? Because I guess he's entering the final year, I think, of his contract. So then he'll be, eligible for that extension. Do you want to continue to pay Trae Young big money, or do you want to move him and potentially, kickstart somewhat of a soft rebuild? Because I think they have the solid core of guys, built around Trae Young. It's just a matter of, is Trae Young the true centerpiece for this offense?
Yeah, exactly. And we'll see what the Hawks do going forward. But, just as a whole, yeah, just kind of rough, just from the perspective of, it felt like they started the year off better than I think we anticipated. But then, it just kind of fell apart by the end of it. And it just felt like, oh, man, like, once the Jalen Johnson went down, you knew it was going to be really problematic. So, like,
Yeah.
that's the problem, I think, for this situation. Then more Nico Harrison stuff. It just continues to just get, like, really silly. I mean, there's stuff about, like, it seemed like there was tension within the team in terms of not knowing how to handle some of the injuries. You had issues going on with Derek Lively. You had issues going on with Luka, right? And then Nico Harrison is like, is like, what did he say? He was like, I haven't spoken ill of Luka at all.
Yeah.
And it just feels like just so comical
Yeah.
at this point. It really is just like a situation where it's just like a complete comedy of errors.
Mhm.
And it's disappointing because, again, he built a good team. Like, we saw what he did last season from the perspective of, he built up a good team. They went to the finals. He made a move that most people were like, what is this guy doing? Like, why is he trading for Kyrie Irving, who had been a problem in previous stops? Why is he trading? Who's this guy, PJ Washington and Daniel Gafford, he's trading for? Then they went to the finals. We liked what they did in the offseason, felt like they improved. And then they just completely ripped it to shreds. And now you're kind of in a weird situation where, again, like, it doesn't even feel like they're in the worst situation in the league, but they're not in a great situation. But we'll see what happens going forward. But it just continues to feel like, because this is coming from Tim McMahon of ESPN, but it just continues to feel like clear divide between Luka and the Dallas front office, and then obviously I guess it continued to move up the ownership, and then eventually they were just like, we're done here. Like, we're not
Yeah.
engaging in this partnership anymore. And it's disappointing because, again, maybe he'll be proven right. Maybe Luka will just stink going forward as a Laker. Get played off the floor defensively. Again, we talked about with this Lakers team, it would be very disappointing if they lost in the first round. But we also know that there's still potential moves to make for them going forward. But what's the move for the Mavs? It just feels like, you're kind of stuck in the spot now where, again, we know that the team has lost a decent amount of its value. And the fans, like, it's a very negative relationship now and you feel bad for the players because, like, even guys like AD, where it's like he didn't do anything wrong. He didn't choose, to get, involved in this trade.
Right.
Obviously he agreed to the trade kicker, but still, it wasn't like he chose to go to Dallas. He didn't even know he was going to Dallas going into this season, right? He expected to probably stay a Laker for a while, right? And then he's, now the fans are getting into it with him and some of the other guys, and it's just a tough situation for literally everybody. And, now the Mavs, it's one of the rough situations in the league, unfortunately.
Yeah, it was definitely, a personal kind of thing. I think with the more and more you hear about it, it definitely seems less of a business transaction and more so of a, well, get off my team kind of thing. And I don't know. It's weird. Very, very weird. And I don't really know what to make of it right now. I think I need to see, how it ends up, 4 years from now. Does Luka have a title in 4 years, or is he one of those guys that just cannot seem to win a title by any means? Like, that's kind of what I'm looking at from that perspective. And where does Dallas, end up in 4 years? Is Nico Harrison even still around on the, as the general manager for that team? I don't know. But the more and more I hear about it, the more and more I can tell this was definitely, a personal agenda and a personal grievances kind of thing where it's like the relationship just soured and it goes beyond ball. That's kind of what I feel like.
Yeah. And again, if you want to look at it in even more detail, Tim McMahon of ESPN put out that piece, so you can look at that on ESPN. But yeah, so now pretty much getting to the conclusion of the episode, we do have a comment to read. We'll just read it from the last YouTube short that we put up. And it was in response to our Warriors or Rockets short that we had, and said, I think it depends on Curry because if the Rockets can bottle him up like they did their last game, he's referring to their last regular season game where he had 3 points, I'm taking the Rockets in 6 or 7. So they didn't bottle him up, but it is one game. So obviously, there's other games to be had. Is he going to play that awesome every game? Feels like that's probably not sustainable, but at the same time, it's Steph. Like, we know he's capable of having crazy series, especially like we said, like the first few minutes were pretty hectic for Golden State where they looked pretty awful, right? Where Houston was just running them out of the gym, forcing turnovers. Steph missed his first 3 looks and then pretty much just literally didn't miss the rest of the way, right? Including, like you said, he got some good looks at the rim. And then after that, everything was just easy for him, or as they say, Stepperless, I guess, right?
Yeah, automatic, really, from him. Once he's in that groove, there's literally nothing you can do. That's why I did enjoy, that first quarter of, Rockets basketball. God, I sound like Nico Harrison, where, he's talking about, we looked like a championship team for 2.5 quarters. Anyway, that's besides the point. But,
that was a real quote?
Yeah.
I swear, I feel like half of the quotes I've seen from him,
they're all real.
Like
they're all real.
Yeah.
There's just no video to them because of the closed door conference. But 2.5 quarters. He quite literally said that. And I believe that was actually reported by the same guy that you were just talking about, Tim McMahon. But, with Houston, I feel like, the key to victory is going to be your defense. But, at the same time, your offense is also going to need to win you games potentially. You're going to need to be able to stay in the fight because it's going to be, a heavyweight fight in terms of, who's going to get more stops, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But, they had the blueprint. They just didn't really execute it perfectly, I think, on certain ends of the floor, like turnovers, all that stuff. We already talked about it. But, the commenter is absolutely right. That is the key to victory.
Yeah. And then on our IG poll, we set up who's winning this series, again, in response to our Warriors Rockets short. And we got 84% of responses picking Golden State to win this series. So, on Instagram, it felt like we didn't get many comments on our short, but like just on Instagram, it felt like it was a little bit more one-sided towards picking Golden State to win this series.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. They have the experience, they have Steph, they have Jimmy. You look at Houston, they don't really have that offensive weapon and, all
Mm,
around well rounded kind of guy.
Yeah. Then we just got a couple things from Underdog that just came out. Isaiah Stewart's ruled out. See what happens if that impacts the game. Then also the draft lottery odds came out, right? So the tiebreakers, were set up. So the Jazz, the Wizards, and the Hornets all have a 14% chance at the number one pick. Then the Pelicans are fourth, 12.5%. Philly, 10.5%. Brooklyn, 9%. Toronto, 7.5%. Spurs at 6%. Then Houston, from that Phoenix thing, right there, it's the Suns pick, 3.8%. Portland 3.7. Again, these are just the odds, the percentage chance that they have of getting the pick. It's not the actual lottery. That's not going to happen, I think, until we get to the conference final. So I want to say that's in May. And then once we get that going, then we'll know the order of the picks, and then we'll know, whether or not we're going to get a crazy script. Are we going to get like Cooper Flag to San Antonio? Is Houston going to get a potential top 5 pick, right? Could Philly keep their pick? Could Oklahoma City? Maybe they storm through maybe they storm their way through the playoffs to a title and then come out of it with a top 10 pick, right? Maybe the Wizards, right? 15 years later, get the number 1 pick, right? To the heir apparent to John Wall. Who knows? So, it's always nice to see. But again, this is based off of, I think, the tiebreakers, regular season, things like that. So, it all comes out and it all balances out by the end.
Yeah. And by the way, side note, Cooper Flag declared for the NBA draft today. So
Yep.
he is leaving Duke and he is entering the draft. So no more of
What a
that
shock.
nonsense. People talking about, yeah, he's not going to return.
Yeah, what a shocker.
Or people thought he was going to return. Sorry.
Yeah, what a shocker.
Yeah.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know in the comments whether or not on our IG shorts or YouTube, or TikTok or whatever, right? Different feeds, right? Let us know what you think about what we just talked about in terms of the playoff matchups, what to look for coming ahead, what we think is going to happen in the next game. Let us know, your thoughts, on maybe some of the other stuff we talked about. What would you like to see going forward from the playoffs? Who do you think should step up? Of course, as I already mentioned, if you want in on our Instagram polls, you just, look for the link on our channel. We post pretty frequently, right? We post about the same frequency for our episodes. And then, of course, we'll read them, just like we read the comments, and continue to like and subscribe to help the channel grow. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next episode.